attacks on government opponents, target perspectives and defenses, by Marczak and Bernd Paxson, and Wynn will give a talk.
Oh, there we go. We're back. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Bill Marczak, and this is joint work with Vern Paxson, my former PhD advisor and now postdoc supervisor at UC Berkeley. I'm also a research fellow at Citizen Lab. We do work at Citizen Lab looking at targeted threats against activists and civil society, which I'll talk a bit more about. So first off, what is a social engineering attack on a government opponent? You know, it's in the title of the paper. What is it? Let me tell you a cool story. So a couple of years ago, we saw this article on Al Jazeera, a Bahrain student sentenced for insulting king. This high school student basically served a year in prison for sending offensive messages towards the king of Bahrain on a Twitter account called Al Qawra News. And this account, we looked at it, there's no mention of this guy's name. So the question was, how did they link this guy to the account? You shouldn't be able to do this on Twitter, right? It's encrypted. You shouldn't be able to get a wiretap and figure out who's accessing which accounts. So we looked at his court case in Bahrain, and we found this document, which is an order filed by the Bahrain public prosecution targeted at an ISP, Batelco, ordering the ISP to uncover the user of an IP address of Al Qawra News at a specific date and time. So somehow there was this IP address associated with this account at a certain date and time. Well, how did this happen? Well, we contacted the account, which was run by many different people, and they forwarded us this message that they'd received around the date and time listed on the court document. And it says, you know, greetings, do you need translation of this link? And there's a link there, goo.gl shortened link. We found out that it went to this site, iplogger.org, which is exactly what it sounds like. It logs your IP address and a specific date and time at which you clicked. And as a result of this, it appeared that the guy was arrested, so this link was only clicked once from Facebook in Bahrain. And the difference in time between when the link was created, according to Google, and when the link was clicked, or when some click happened, according to the court document, was about 21 hours later. So it appears that this was the link that was sent by the government, or by someone who passed the information to the government, which then led to this guy being arrested and serving a year in prison. Okay, that's a cool story, right? But is this really a big problem? Do civil society, do dissidents, do activists, do journalists get targeted like this, you know, all the time, or is this just a one-off thing? Well, it turns out this is actually kind of a big deal. Here's some headlines from the past few years. You can see that this is, you know, something that happens time and time again in many different countries: Ethiopia, Bahrain, UAE. My favorite is this Jezebel headline: hackers lured Syrian rebels with sexy pics and stole their battle plans. So this is something that's common. In fact, there was even an article a couple weeks ago in the New York Times on the front page about how Mexican activists were being targeted by presumably the government with sophisticated spyware, which led to a big ongoing scandal right now in Mexico, Gobierno Espía, where civil society is trying to press the government to investigate the alleged hacking of the opposition. In fact, if you think, you know, all news is fake news, there was actually a session about this in Usenix Usenix Security a couple years ago, where there were 3 papers, including one that I worked on. So this is something that happens. This is you know, something that's definitely going on, and it is a big deal. So what does this look like? Well, from a few examples of the reporting over the past few years, targets receive documents, emails, messages sort of like this. For instance, some UAE journalists were invited to enable macros in a Word document like this. Mexican activists got messages, you know, telling them that their daughter was in an accident, and, you know, with a link that would have infected their phones on a single click. And, you know, Bahraini activists received, you know, fake torture reports with exe files disguised as images, and Ethiopian journalists received, you know, messages on Skype with malicious files. So this is a pattern that happens over and over in many different countries. And the question is, well, what do the potential targets, people who are either being targeted or possibly might be targeted by governments or other powerful actors, how do these people perceive the attacks and their risk, and how do they protect themselves? So that's where this paper comes in. So essentially what I've been doing in collaboration with my advisor, Vern, for the past few years, specifically since 2014, is conducting IRB-approved interviews of potential targets or people that we believe or that they believe themselves might be targeted by this sort of surveillance. And I divide the interviews up into 4 different groups. So one of them was a human rights organization. Some activists were on the ground in GCC countries, the GCC being the Gulf Cooperation Council, so UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman. I might be forgetting 1 or 2. So the third group, D, is members of the GCC diaspora, so people from these countries that live overseas, like in the UK and US, and also members of a media organization affiliated with a country in the Horn of Africa. This is not a state media organization, it's a diaspora opposition media organization. So again, there's more details about the specific demographic breakdown of everything in the paper, but this is just a high-level overview of the groups. So the first question that I asked was fairly simple, just to gauge a sense of what people thought about their risk. So the question was, how likely is it the government is tracking your online activities? And the results in the paper are broken down by 4 different groups. You can see the median here is 4, where 5 is definitely being tracked, and 1 is definitely not. So clearly most people thinking that there's a significant amount of tracking going on here. The follow-up was, well, to what degree do you believe that your online activities are safe or place you at risk? And I categorized these into 2 different categories: high risk, meaning more likely than not, greater than 50%, and also light risk. The majority believing that they were at a high risk of not being safe. And what were the specific risks that people mentioned? Well, there were quite a bunch. The most popular one was surveillance. I categorized with the label surveillance. And these were responses like, oh, I'm worried that someone is going to be looking at my emails, things like that. Punishment included things like being arrested or tortured, and that was feared by about 6 people. Predominantly, as you can see, by Group G, which was the people on the ground in countries where they'd faced risks from the local government. Some people also feared things like, publicity, meaning that their information would be published without their consent, or there'd be risks to their friends. They might suffer financial losses, and there'd be risks to their information not being able to be accessed, or some sort of damage associated with it, or risks. In fact, only 1 person mentioned risks from cloud providers potentially accessing their data. In fact, the subject population that we were looking at was actually pretty interesting because a number of them had already suffered consequences that they attributed as a result of their online activities. And again, this wasn't something we specifically asked about, but it was something that came up during the course of these interviews. So 1 subject had actually been physically assaulted. He attributed this, or the subject attributed this to something they had posted on Twitter. An activist had served a year in prison and was released and found that their passwords were changed. Other subjects were sacked from their job, had their accounts hacked, received threats, etc. There's full details. This is just a summary. There's full details in the paper. So the next thing that I asked was asked about issues that they had with their mobile phones, including checking security settings on their phones, and also computers. I'll present the results for phones pretty quickly, and the results for computers are in the paper. So one of the most common issues was that the phones weren't encrypted. And of course, this is a risk for a number of reasons. In many cases, in these countries on the ground, the phones will be confiscated at police checkpoints or during house raids, or even if the phone is misplaced or stolen, there could be risks to the data. So there were a number of problems with various encryption mechanisms that that came out during these interviews. Some subjects had enabled it, but it didn't appear to still be working. There was actually 1 interesting case which sort of highlights the difference of the subject set compared with other subject sets, which was that 1 of the subjects had enabled the auto wipe feature along with encryption, and a policeman took the subject's phone, entered the PIN incorrectly 5 times, and the guy's data was lost because it wasn't backed up. So that subject was reluctant to enable encryption in the future because they sort of conflated in their minds this idea of encryption with auto wipe. Another subject had this interesting belief that they could only exchange files with people that had the same version of Android if they turned on encryption on their Android phone, if the phone was encrypted. A lot of subjects actually had a preference for this pattern password thing, which is this sort of thing that you can do on Android phones where you drag like a pattern to unlock your phone. And one of the subjects who wanted to use their pattern password couldn't figure out how to use it with encryption and said, hey, if I've got to type out a password, that's too inconvenient. And one thing to note is that a lot of this questioning was done before subjects had phones that have the new fingerprint unlock feature. So there was another dual issue regarding phone settings with respect to encryption, which is that most subjects did not seem to be able to have an idea of what they would do, or they might not do anything if they lost or misplaced their phone, which would be an issue if the phone was indeed unencrypted because the data could easily be extracted. There were also issues where a number of subjects, in fact, nine phones examined did not have any sort of password on it. And there's also a preference of using the most basic form of password that the phone supports, such as a 4-digit PIN. So the next thing we looked at was issues with sideloading and rooting, and I'll very quickly go through this issue of sideloading, which is enabling an option or jailbreaking your phone to enable installation of apps from outside the Google Play Store or the iPhone Store or something like this. Of the 6 sideloaded phones, 1 was a jailbroken iPhone and 5 were Androids. And the reasons are sort of what you might expect, these apps to enable access to less than legitimate entertainment content. Interestingly, one activist wanted to use a second copy of WhatsApp with an anonymous phone number. So they jailbroke their iPhone to install 2 copies of WhatsApp, one for using their real phone number to communicate with family and friends, and one for anonymous phone number for activism. And then 2 subjects did not know why the option was enabled on their phone. And this is critical because some attacks that we've seen, particularly in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, involve links to app files sent through text messages which are not in the store. And if you have sideloading enabled, there's one less warning before installation. As you might imagine, there were also issues with phone updates. iPhones were pretty up to date, and Androids were pretty out of date. Which again is a risk because off-the-shelf attack tools, such as the spyware used by these governments, or even spyware you can download, embeds known exploits for rooting old phone versions. There were also issues with subjects did not have a strategy about what they do if they lost access to their email account, even though they acknowledged that it was likely that their government would try and steal Twitter, Facebook email passwords and then use those passwords to access the accounts and target friends from those accounts. One of the last things we asked was about vetting messages, because so many of these attacks are through social engineering messages. Most subjects remarked that they'd check some aspect of the sender of the message to determine whether any sort of link or attachment was legitimate, as well as the context of the message. And by context, I mean things like, did they greet me properly? Are there spelling errors? Is this a message that this person is likely to have sent? Unfortunately, though, these are the two main things that social engineering focuses on plausibly replicating in these messages. And the other key point here is that people that we asked about this think that they're doing a good job. They think that their method of checking these links and attachments and messages makes them appreciably safer. Okay, so interesting results. That was fun. But now that I'm running out of time, what can we take away from this? So one of the main takeaways is, vulnerability here to social engineering. So I won't spend too much time on that. Another one is this notion of optional versus mandatory security. We saw a clear preference for subjects to try and avoid using security if it would interfere, or they had previous bad experiences, or it was too confusing if it was optional, and a preference for using the least secure or least advanced password technique. There was also a number of things we noticed with regard to folk models of security or artisanal security practices, which may or may not actually make you safer, such as the anonymous copy of WhatsApp, rooting your phone to install that. One subject talked about swapping SIM cards, rooting to install a privacy app. There were also these notions that, Gmail is safe, Google Play Store is safe, or if I can notice things to know if I'm under surveillance, like my computer running slow. Things like Gmail always gives you a sign that something's wrong. And one subject, S26, had these 2 quotes. So the subject said, when you experience a lot of being victimized and targeted, you develop an intuition and are cautious about these things. And this subject actually did interact with a malicious message and then only later realized it and contacted us for help to see if he was at risk from that message. There's also, of course, a desire, and this is my last slide, there's a desire to focus on work, which a number of the subjects shared, which was, essentially, we have a job, we're trying to keep people out of prison, people from suffering, we're trying to help people. Should I spend a day figuring out digital security, or should I do work? You've got to open attachments, you've got to exchange links. This is a feature of civil society. You've got to do this so that, you can continue working and life goes on. And this potentially suggests, as a direction for future work, a tool that could help integrate with workflows and provide context to help vet messages beyond checking senders visually and checking the context around the message. And thank you, everybody. So I'd like to acknowledge the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity at Berkeley for funding me, as well as Bahrain Watch, which was useful in collaborating with setting up interviews with activists. And I invite any questions. Thank you.